I sat at the end of the long mahogany table, my fingers tracing the carved edge as I listened to the low murmur of conversations around me. The room smelled of leather and old books, like wealth had been soaked into the walls for generations. Above the fireplace, the portrait of my grandfather glared down his eyes, cold, even in oil and canvas. I was the last to arrive, and it didn't go unnoticed. My cousin Trevor leaned back in his chair, a smirk on his face that made me wish I could slap it off. Aunt Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line, her pearl earrings glinting in the light of the crystal chandelier. They all looked so sure of themselves, so sure of their place here. And me, I was the outsider they never wanted to acknowledge. The lawyer, Mr. Harrington, cleared his throat and shuffled some papers. He was an older man with silver hair and a pinstripe suit that looked like it had been tailored back when men still carried pocket watches. His voice was steady as he addressed the room. "Thank you all for coming today. As you know, we're here to read the last will and testament of Henry Whitmore." He paused, looking over his glasses at each of us in turn. "I trust you understand the gravity of these proceedings." Trevor snorted softly, rolling his eyes at his sister Clara, who giggled behind her hand. My father's family had always treated me like a stray dog, taken in out of obligation, and never truly welcomed. My mother died when I was 10, and from that moment on, I was a shadow in these grand halls. Mr. Harrington continued, but I barely heard the words. My mind was stuck on the memory of my mother, her warm smile, the smell of vanilla on her skin. She used to tell me stories about this place back when it still felt like home. Now it was just another cold reminder of everything I'd lost. And in accordance with Henry Whitmore's wishes, the estate will be divided among his children and grandchildren. "Striors, sound," Harrington was saying. His tone was factual, his expression neutral, but I could feel the tension in the room. My father's siblings leaned forward, hungry for what they believed was theirs. And what about her Aunt Evelyn's voice, cut through the air like a knife? She didn't even look at me, her eyes were on Mr. Harrington, as if I wasn't worth the effort. I held my breath. I knew this was coming. I'd heard the whispers in the hallway, the sideways glances during family dinners. To them, I was nothing more than a footnote in their perfect little narrative. Mr. Harrington hesitated, then turned to me. "As for Miss Lila Whitmore," every head in the room turned. I could feel the weight of their stares, the collective anticipation of my failure. "It is stated in the will that she will not inherit a single cent." A silence fell over the room, thick and heavy. Trevor let out a short bark of laughter, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. "Well, that settles that," he said. I felt my cheeks flush, but I refused to let the tears come. I'd known this was a possibility. My grandfather had never liked me, much always saw me as my mother's child, not his. But hearing it said out loud in front of everyone, it stung worse than I imagined. Clara gave me a pitying smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Leela, I guess this means you'll have to find your own way now." I forced myself to sit up straighter, my hands resting on the table so no one would see them shake. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. Mr. Harrington wasn't done. He lifted a finger as if to ward off the celebration that was already brewing in the eyes of my cousins. However, he said slowly, and the room fell silent again. "There is an addendum to the will, a conditional clause." The atmosphere shifted. Aunt Evelyn's head snapped around to glare at him. Trevor frowned, his smug expression faltering. "What do you mean, a conditional clause?" Uncle Thomas asked, his voice tight. Mr. Harrington adjusted his glasses, reading from the paper in front of him. "The will states that if Miss Lila can fulfill a certain condition within a year of Mr. Whitmore's passing, she will inherit the entirety of the estate." I felt a jolt of something, hope, maybe, or just the shock of possibility. The entire estate. Aunt Evelyn's face flushed red. "This is ridiculous," she spat. "What condition?" Mr. Harrington looked at me, then his eyes softening just a fraction. "She must find the truth about her mother," he said. "The truth that Henry Whitmore hid from the world, and from her." The words hung in the air like a challenge. My heart pounded in my chest. The truth about my mother. What did that even mean? I'd grown up with stories of her kindness, her laughter, but there were always places in her past that no one would talk about. Trevor laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. That's a fool's errand, he said. There is no truth to find. She's dead and buried, and so is her story. But I saw something else in Mr. Harrington's eyes. A glimmer of something he couldn't say out loud. And in that moment, I knew there was more. My mother's story wasn't finished, and neither was mine. I stood slowly, pushing back my chair. The room was still as I lifted my chin and met each pair of eyes in turn. I guess I'd better start looking then, I said quietly. Aunt Evelyn scoffed, but I didn't care. I turned and walked out of that room, out of that suffocating house of whispers and lies. The last thing I saw was the portrait of my grandfather, still watching, still judging. But for the first time, I didn't feel small beneath his gaze. Because no matter what they thought, I wasn't done yet. I was just getting started. The heavy oak doors of the study closed behind me with a hollow thud that echoed down the marble hallway. My footsteps sounded louder than they should have, a steady beat that seemed to drown out the whispers, already starting to swirl in the air behind me. I didn't look back. The truth was, I didn't need to hear them to know what they were saying. I could imagine Trevor's smirk, Aunt Evelyn's cutting laugh, Uncle Thomas's grumbled agreement. They were probably already toasting to my failure, congratulating themselves on a job well done. After all, they'd spent years perfecting the art of making me feel like I didn't belong. I pushed open the door to the foyer, the cold marble under my shoes grounding me. For a moment, I paused by the grand staircase, running my fingers along the carved banister. This house had been in our family for generations, a fortress of secrets and whispers. I'd grown up wandering these halls, always feeling like a ghost in my own home. As I reached for the front door, I caught my reflection in the mirror hanging on the wall. My face looked pale, my eyes too bright. But there was something else there too, a spark of defiance I hadn't felt in a long time. I stepped outside, letting the cold winter air bite at my cheeks. The sky was heavy with snow clouds, and the first flakes were just beginning to fall. The driveway stretched out before me, lined with skeletal trees that rattled in the wind like old bones. My car was parked at the end, a small sedan that looked out of place next to the luxury vehicles of my cousins. I got in and shut the door, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. My mind was spinning. What did it mean, the truth about my mother? Why had my grandfather made it a condition of the will? And what truth was so important it could change everything? As I sat there, the memory of my mother came back to me in a rush. Her laugh soft and warm. The way she used to tuck my hair behind my ear when I was little, whispering, "Don't let them make you feel small, Leela." But she'd never talked about her past, not really. It was as if she'd shut a door in her mind and locked it tight. I started the car, the engine coughing to life in the cold. My breath fogged the windshield as I pulled out of the driveway, the mansion looming behind me like a shadow I couldn't quite escape. The drive back to my tiny apartment in the city was a blur. I barely noticed the bare trees lining the highway, the snow piling up on the sides of the road. My mind was a storm of questions and half-remembered conversations, snatches of things my mother used to say, half-truths I'd always been too afraid to chase down. When I got home, the apartment felt even smaller than usual. The heat was on full blast, but I still felt cold to the bone. I tossed my coat over the back of the couch and sank onto the cushions, pulling my knees up to my chest. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, messages from cousins I hadn't heard from in years, all suddenly so interested in my life. I didn't bother to read them. I knew what they'd say. "Just accept it, Lila. You'll never find anything. Don't embarrass yourself." Instead, I scrolled through the old photos I'd saved on my phone. Pictures of my mother always half turned away from the camera, as if she was trying to hide even then. There was one of her in front of the old garden at the estate, her smile bright despite the gray sky overhead. I stared at it, trying to see something, some clue, some sign of what she'd kept hidden. The next morning, I woke up early, the questions from last night still rattling around in my head. I made a pot of coffee and sat at the tiny kitchen table, the steam curling around my face as I thought about what to do next. If there was a truth to find, I had to start somewhere. And the only place that made sense was the past. My mother's past. I pulled out a worn cardboard box from the closet, my mother's things, the only pieces of her I'd managed to keep. Old letters, faded photos, a few trinkets that had meant the world to her. I sifted through them slowly, careful not to let the weight of nostalgia drag me under. Near the bottom of the box, I found a small leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed with age, the writing delicate and looping. My mother's handwriting. I traced the letters with my fingers, my heart beating faster. The first few pages were full of memories I already knew, stories about me as a baby, funny little notes about the weather, the garden. But as I turned the pages, the tone shifted. The writing grew heavier, more urgent. I can't tell Lila everything. Not yet. But someday she'll have to know. I sucked in a breath. What hadn't she told me? What had been so important she'd written it down, but never said it out loud? I flipped ahead, my eyes scanning the entries for answers. But the last few pages were torn out, leaving only ragged edges. My stomach twisted. Someone didn't want me to know what she'd written there. I sat back, the journal clutched to my chest. The words on those missing pages felt like a promise and a threat all at once. Whatever they said, they were the key to everything. I knew what I had to do. I spent the next few hours calling anyone who might know something old, family, friends, distant relatives I hadn't seen since I was a kid. Most of them brushed me off, but one name kept coming up: Margaret Ellis, my mother's closest friend. I remembered Margaret vaguely, her kind eyes, the way she'd always had a hand on my shoulder, like she was trying to keep me safe. If anyone knew the truth, it would be her. I found her number in an old address book and dialed it, my hand shaking as I waited for the line to connect. Hello. Her voice was warm, familiar, even after all these years. Margaret, it's Lila, I said. I need to talk to you about my mother. There was a long pause. Oh, Lila, she said finally. I always knew this day would come. Come see me tomorrow. I'll tell you everything I know. As I hung up, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't hope exactly. It was something sharper, like resolve, or maybe just the stubborn refusal to let them win. They said I'd never get a penny, but I was going to find the truth. And once I did, they'd have no choice but to see me for who I really was. The next morning, I woke up to a pale winter sun breaking through the cracks in my curtains. My breath hung in the air like smoke as I wrapped myself in my mother's old cardigan. Even though the fabric was thin and worn, it still smelled faintly of her perfume, lavender, and something softer like hope. I made a quick breakfast, though my stomach was too tight to eat. My mind was already 1,000 miles away, turning over every possibility. What did Margaret know, and why had my mother trusted her with the truth? The drive to Margaret's small farmhouse took me out of the city and down winding country roads, past fields crusted with frost, and old barns that looked like they'd been abandoned for decades. When I pulled up to the house, a white clapboard structure with a sagging porch, Margaret was already outside, waving at me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Lila, she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled of fresh bread and wood smoke. You're the spitting image of her, you know. Your mother. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. I need to know Margaret. What did she mean about the truth? Why would my grandfather make it the key to everything? Margaret's smile faded. She gestured for me to come inside. The warmth of her kitchen was a balm after the cold, the scent of coffee and cinnamon lingering in the air. She poured me a cup and set it in front of me, her hands trembling just a little. Your mother was special, she began softly, and she carried a burden she never should have had to bear alone. I leaned forward, my fingers wrapped around the warm mug. What kind of burden? Margaret sighed, her eyes drifting to the window. Your grandfather, he was a proud man, but he was also cruel when it suited him. Your mother fell in love with someone he didn't approve of, and he never forgave her for it. I frowned. I thought she married my father. That was her only love, wasn't it? Margaret shook her head slowly. No, Lila. Your father was her second chance. Before him there was someone else, someone who meant everything to her. My heart pounded. Who I don't know his name, Margaret admitted. She kept that part close to her chest. But I do know he was from a family your grandfather despised. They were old rivals, money power, all the petty things that mattered to him more than her happiness. I felt a shiver run through me. So he cut her off, Margaret nodded. Worse. He made sure no one would ever speak of it. He threatened anyone who tried to tell the truth. But your mother never stopped loving that man, even after she married your father. She told me once, "The heart doesn't choose what's convenient, Margaret. It just chooses." I sat back, the weight of those words pressing on my chest. So much of my life suddenly made sense, the hushed arguments I'd overheard as a child, the way my mother's eyes would go distant sometimes, as if she were looking back at something she could never reach. But how does this help me? I asked quietly. Why would Grandpa put this in his will? Margaret met my gaze. Because he knew, and because he was ashamed. He didn't want the world to know how far he'd gone to destroy your mother's happiness. But he also knew that the truth was out there, and he was afraid it would come back to haunt him. I swallowed hard. So if I find out who this man was, what he meant to my mother, that proves I deserve the estate, Margaret nodded. He tied it all to that secret. Maybe he thought it would stay buried forever. But your mother left clues, Lila. She wanted you to find them. She wanted you to know who she really was. The weight of it settled over me like a second skin. I felt the fear and the excitement tangled together in my chest. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about my mother, about everything she'd been forced to hide. I reached out and took Margaret's hand. Thank you, I said softly. I don't know how to repay you. You don't owe me anything, she said, squeezing my hand. Just be careful. There are people who would rather this secret stay buried. I nodded. I understood the risk, but I also knew that if I turned back now, I'd be betraying everything my mother had tried to protect. As I drove back to the city, my thoughts were a whirl of possibilities. Where could I even begin? My mother's journals were missing pages, pages that might hold the name I needed. But if they'd been torn out, maybe they were still somewhere in the old mansion. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was Trevor. Where did you run off to? Trying to play Detective Lila. You'll never find what you're looking for. I stared at the message for a moment, then shut off the phone. His words didn't scare me. They only made me more determined. When I got home, I pulled the journal out again, tracing the edges of the torn pages. My mind kept going back to the old house, to the cold marble halls, the locked doors, the creaking floorboards. If there were answers, that's where they'd be. I spent the next few days planning. I knew the staff would be around during the day, cooks, cleaners, all the people who'd seen me as an afterthought for years. I'd have to go at night, when the house was quiet, and the ghosts of the past were loudest. On the third night, I parked my car at the edge of the estate, the moon, a pale silver coin, above me. The wind was sharp against my face as I slipped through the side gate, my breath catching in the cold air. My heart pounded in my ears with every step. I knew the house like the back of my hand, every creak in the floorboards, every hidden nook. I moved through the shadows, my flashlight beam flickering across portraits that stared down with disapproval. In the east wing, there was a door I'd never seen open. My mother used to say it was locked for a reason. As I approached, I felt a shiver run down my spine. My hand closed around the cold brass handle. It turned. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled down into darkness. My pulse quickened as I stepped inside, the air cool and heavy, with the scent of earth and old wood. At the bottom, I found a small room, stone walls lined with shelves, boxes stacked high with yellowed papers and cracked leather bindings. In the dim light, I could just make out a single name written on a file in spidery handwriting. My mother's name. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the paper fragile under my fingertips. The file was thick, filled with letters, photographs, and something else, something that made my breath catch in my throat. A single name written over and over in the margins. The man she'd loved. The truth. I stared at the name scrawled on the papers, my breath shallow. It was as if time had stopped around me, the silence of that hidden room pressing in from every direction. My mother's name was written in delicate loops, but next to it, in a bolder, more desperate hand, was the name of the man she had loved, James Fletcher. The name felt unfamiliar on my tongue as I whispered it into the cold air. My pulse hammered in my ears. Who was he? And why had my grandfather worked so hard to bury the connection between them? I sank to the ground, the rough stone floor cold, even through the denim of my jeans. With trembling fingers, I began to sort through the letters and documents in the file. They were old, some yellowed and brittle, others still crisp, as if they'd never seen the light of day. Each one was a puzzle piece, a glimpse into a past I'd never been allowed to see. There were love letters, beautiful, heartbreaking words, written in my mother's delicate script. She spoke of dreams and fears, of stolen moments, under the moonlight, of a love she knew was doomed, but couldn't walk away from. And always, always, she ended with his name. James. I closed my eyes and imagined her as a young woman, full of hope and defiance, loving someone she wasn't supposed to. I could almost see her in the candlelight of these halls, her laughter echoing in the darkness, her smile brighter than any inheritance. But the letters grew darker as I read on. Hints of threats from my grandfather, warnings to stay away, to forget James Fletcher's name. My mother had been forced to choose her heart or her family, and in the end, she chose me. I pressed my hand to the page, feeling the weight of her sacrifice. This was what my grandfather wanted. Hidden, this was the truth he'd tied my inheritance to. A truth that, if I proved, it would make me the rightful heir to everything he'd tried to keep from me. I gathered the letters into a neat stack, my hands steady now. The weight of them was both terrifying and exhilarating. My mother's voice was in these pages stronger than the grave, demanding to be heard. As I slipped them into my bag, a floorboard above me creaked. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I was frozen, every nerve in my body straining to catch another sound. The house was supposed to be empty, no staff at this hour, no family left to haunt these halls. But another creak followed, closer this time. My heart pounded as I killed the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. I pressed myself against the cold stone, barely daring to breathe. A faint light flickered in the crack beneath the door at the top of the stairs. Footsteps, muffled but unmistakable, descended slowly, deliberately. I clutched the file to my chest. Whoever it was, they couldn't see me here, couldn't know what I'd found. I edged backward, feeling along the wall for another exit, some hidden passage that might save me. The steps stopped just outside the door, the handle rattling softly. I held my breath, praying that whoever it was would leave, that they'd decide the room was empty and go back to bed. But the door swung open, and a narrow beam of light cut through the darkness. Trevor. His silhouette was outlined in the doorway, flashlight in hand. He looked down at me, and for a moment, his expression was blank surprise, maybe, or disbelief. Then it twisted into a smile, cold and sharp. "Well, well," he drawled. "Look who decided to go snooping in the family crypt." I forced myself to stand, the papers clutched tightly in my arms. "I'm not snooping. I'm finding the truth." Trevor stepped into the room, his footsteps deliberate, the flashlight sweeping across the dusty shelves. "You're playing a dangerous game, Lila," he said, his voice low. "This isn't a fairy tale. It won't end with you winning." My eyes didn't waver from his. "I'm not here to win. I'm here to claim what's mine." He snorted, but I saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "What do you think you're going to do with those?" he asked, gesturing to the file. "Show them to a judge, to the world. No one's going to believe the bastard child of a family scandal." My jaw tightened. "That's what you're afraid of, isn't it? That people will believe me?" He took another step forward, close enough that I could see the anger in the tight lines around his mouth. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he hissed. "This estate, this family, it's not yours. It never was. But it was my mother's," I shot back. "And she's the reason any of this even exists." For a moment, the mask slipped. His mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came out. Then his eyes hardened again. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Walk away now, and I'll make sure you're taken care of. But if you keep pushing, if you keep digging, I'll bury you, Lila. Just like they buried her." I felt the fear in my gut, cold and sour. But I didn't let it show. Do what you have to, I said quietly. I'm not backing down. He glared at me for another long moment, then turned and stalked back up the stairs. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving me alone in the darkness again. I stood there for a moment, shaking, then took a deep breath and forced my feet to move. I retraced my steps through the mansion, slipping out the way I'd come. The cold night air was a relief, washing away the scent of dust and old secrets. As I drove away from the estate, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, I realized something. Trevor wasn't just a bully. He was scared. Scared of what I knew and what I was going to do with it. The next morning, I went straight to Mr. Harrington's office. The stately brick building was quiet, the reception area hushed in the early morning light. His secretary, a kind woman named Edith, raised her eyebrows as I walked in, clutching the file like a lifeline. I need to see Mr. Harrington, I said, my voice steady. She must have seen something in my eyes, because she didn't ask questions. She just picked up the phone and called him down. A few minutes later, Mr. Harrington appeared, his silver hair impeccable as always. "Lila," he said, concern flickering across his features. "What is it?" I held out the file. "I found what he was hiding," I said. "The truth about my mother. About James Fletcher." He took the file, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the pages. When he looked back up at me, his expression was unreadable. "You understand," he said slowly, "that this changes everything." "I do," I said. My voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "I'm not going to let them keep it buried anymore." He closed the file and nodded. "Then let's make sure the world knows it too." I left Mr. Harrington's office with the file clutched tightly in my hand, my mind a storm of thoughts. The truth was out now, or at least the beginning of it, but I knew that uncovering James Fletcher's name was only the first step in a much larger battle. My mother's story, our family's story, was still locked behind closed doors, hidden under layers of shame and denial. As I stepped out into the crisp winter air, the world seemed to tilt just a little, as if everything I thought I knew was shifting under my feet. The snow had begun to fall again, flakes drifting lazily from a gray sky. I watched them melt on the file in my hand, the ink of the old letters safe inside, but my heart felt exposed to the cold. I drove back to my apartment, in a daze, replaying the conversation with Mr. Harrington over and over. He had promised to look into the legal implications of what I'd found, to see if it would be enough to satisfy the condition in my grandfather's will. But he'd also warned me this wasn't going to be easy. There would be resistance. There would be threats. I already knew that. I'd seen it in Trevor's eyes. Back in my small kitchen, I spread the letters and photographs out across the table, each piece of paper, a breadcrumb leading back to the woman my mother used to be. I traced the elegant loops of her handwriting, the tenderness in her words to James Fletcher, and the fear that laced every page. She had been so young, so brave. I made a list of names, people who might still remember. Old family friends, neighbors from the town where my mother had grown up. If there was more to her story, I would find it. I owed her that much. The next day, I started at the county records office, a squat brick building that smelled of mildew and dust. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as I explained what I was looking for. Birth records, marriage certificates, anything that would tie my mother to James Fletcher. She gave me a tired smile. "You're in for a long day," she said, handing me a stack of index cards. "These go back decades, and not everything's been digitized." I spent hours in that cramped room, hunched over old ledgers, my fingers tracing faded names in careful script. Some records had been lost to time, others damaged by floods and fires, but I found enough to start piecing together the shape of a life. James Fletcher had been a young lawyer, ambitious, with a reputation for fighting for the underdog. My grandfather must have hated that. To him, status was everything, and love didn't matter if it threatened the family name. I found their marriage license hidden in a dusty file from over 30 years ago. My mother had married James in secret just a month before I was born. My chest tightened as I stared at the two signatures side by side. The ink faded, but still there, undeniable proof of a love that had survived in whispers and shadows. I took a shaky breath. This was it, the truth my grandfather had tried so hard to erase. My mother and James had been married, and I was the child of that union, the rightful heir by blood and by love. As I left the records office, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. For the first time, I wasn't just chasing ghosts. I was standing on solid ground with something real to hold on to. But I knew this was only the beginning. The past doesn't stay buried without a fight. I drove back to the estate that night, the file of records beside me on the seat. My fingers tapped nervously on the wheel as the mansion came into view, its windows dark and unwelcoming. I parked at the edge of the driveway, my breath fogging the glass as I watched the flickering lights in the east wing. Someone was still awake. I didn't care. I had to see for myself to stand in that place one more time. I slipped through the side gate, the snow muffling my footsteps. The air smelled of pine and cold stone, the kind of scent that makes you feel like you're walking through history. My history. Inside the house was quiet, except for the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hall. I moved carefully, the file pressed against my chest, my heart beating in rhythm with the clock's slow, steady chime. In the drawing room, I found a portrait of my mother I'd never noticed before. She was younger there, her eyes bright, her smile secretive. My hand hovered over the frame, tracing the lines of her face. I could almost hear her voice in the hush of the room, telling me not to give up. I sank into one of the old armchairs, the leather cracked and cool against my skin. The weight of the house settled around me, but for the first time it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like possibility. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from Mr. Harrington. "We have enough to contest the will, but you need to be ready. They won't let this go without a fight." I typed back, my fingers steady. "I'm ready." I closed my eyes and leaned back in the chair, the file warm against my chest. My mother's words echoed in my mind. The heart doesn't choose what's convenient. It just chooses. I understood that now, in a way I never had before. My mother had chosen love, and it had cost her everything. But I wouldn't let her sacrifice be for nothing. I would fight for her, for James Fletcher, and for the life she'd been denied. As I left the mansion that night, I paused at the front door, turning back to look at the house one last time. The snow had stopped the sky, clear and cold, the stars sharp as diamonds. I whispered into the quiet, "I'm not done yet." And I meant every word. The night was still and sharp when I pulled back into the city. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. The papers I'd found, my mother's marriage license, the letters she'd written to James, felt like pieces of a puzzle I'd been holding in my hands my whole life, without even knowing it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, the old file spread out before me, reading each word again and again. My mother's voice came alive in those pages, her hope, her heartbreak, her quiet determination. And now it was my turn to carry that torch. By the time the sky lightened to a pale gray, I knew what I had to do. Margaret had told me about a room, my mother's secret room in the estate, a place she'd used to keep her treasures and memories safe from prying eyes. I'd never found it as a child, though I'd looked, but now I had clues and a reason to try. I drove back to the estate that morning, the snow crunching under my tires, the sky threatening more clouds. The mansion loomed ahead, stately and silent, like it was holding its breath. I parked at the edge of the property again, heart pounding as if the house itself was watching me. I let myself in through the side door, the one that had always stuck just a little in the winter. The scent of old wood and cold air greeted me like an old, unwelcome friend. I moved quietly, the file clutched in my hand, my breath clouding in the chilly hallways. My mother's journals had mentioned the hidden room in passing, the place where I keep what matters, she'd written in one entry. But she'd never said where it was. So I did what I'd always done when I was little. I followed the light. I moved from room to room, opening doors that hadn't been touched in years, my fingers brushing over dust-covered furniture and faded wallpaper. Each step felt like a question. Was this where she'd hidden her secrets? I could almost feel her presence in the quiet, her laughter echoing faintly, the way she'd smiled at me when no one else was watching. In the library, I paused. The tall shelves loomed over me, packed with books that smelled of leather and time. My mother had always loved this room. She'd taught me to read here, her fingers tracing the words in children's books as I stumbled through them. I ran my hand along the edge of one shelf, my fingers catching on a small, barely noticeable latch. My heart stopped. I pressed it gently, and with a soft click, the shelf shifted, opening just a crack. A hidden door. I hesitated for just a moment, then pushed it open. The passage beyond was narrow and dark, the air cool and damp. I stepped inside the door, closing behind me, with a soft thud that made my breath hitch in my throat. The room was small, no bigger than a closet really, but it was filled with light. A single window high on the wall let in a shaft of winter sun that caught on the dust motes dancing in the air. And there in the center of the room was a small wooden chest. I knelt in front of it, my hands trembling as I lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, letters, and a single delicate necklace, a silver locket I remembered seeing around my mother's neck when I was small. I lifted it gently, the chain cold against my skin. Inside the locket was a tiny photograph, worn with age, but still clear, my mother and James Fletcher, standing together in the garden, their hands clasped, their smiles bright and sure. My throat tightened. This was it. This was the proof of everything she'd never been allowed to say. As I sifted through the rest of the chest, I found something else, a sealed envelope with my name on it. My fingers trembled as I opened it, unfolding the paper inside. My dearest Lila, if you're reading this, then you've found what I could never give you in life, the truth. James was my first love, my greatest heartbreak, and your father in every way that mattered. Your grandfather tried to erase him, but I could never let him go, not in my heart and not in yours. You are the best of us, Lila. Stronger than you know. Don't let them make you doubt that. This estate, this family, it's your birthright, not because of what's written in a will, but because of who you are. Never forget that I loved you, and I believe in you. Love, always, Mother. I pressed the letter to my chest, hot tears slipping down my cheeks. In that quiet, hidden room, I felt her arms around me again, her warmth, her love. And I knew deep in my bones that I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance. I was fighting for her, for the life she'd been denied, for the truth she'd kept alive even when it cost her everything. I carefully packed the letters and photographs back into the chest, the locket around my neck. As I stood, I felt a quiet strength settle over me, a sense of purpose I'd never known before. I wasn't just Lila, the forgotten granddaughter. I was Lila, my mother's daughter, and I wasn't going to let them bury her story anymore. When I stepped out of the hidden room, the house seemed different somehow. The walls no longer felt so cold, the shadows less menacing. My footsteps echoed with confidence as I made my way back to the main hall. But as I reached the grand staircase, I saw a figure waiting at the top. Trevor. He was leaning against the banister, his arms crossed, a mocking smile on his face. "You really don't know when to quit, do you, Lila?" he drawled. I met his gaze steadily, my shoulders square. "No," I said simply. "I don't." He pushed off the banister, taking a slow step down the stairs. "You think you found something that will change everything. But this family, we're not about to let you waltz in and claim what you think you deserve." I lifted my chin. "It's not about what I deserve. It's about what's true." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're in over your head, cousin. And trust me, you're not ready for what's coming." I felt a flicker of fear, but I swallowed it down. "We'll see," I said quietly, "because I'm not going anywhere." And as I turned and walked out of that house, the winter sun warming my face, I knew he was right about one thing: I wasn't ready for what was coming. But I would be. For my mother. For me. For everything they said I'd never have. The cold air outside the mansion felt like a slap across my face, sharp and bracing. My breath puffed out in white clouds as I walked to my car, the locket heavy against my chest. I closed my fingers around it, feeling the slight weight of the silver and the memories it held. My mother's letter had settled something inside me, a piece of the puzzle finally snapping into place. But as I drove away from the estate, the weight of what was coming pressed down on my shoulders. Trevor's threat still echoed in my ears. He wasn't just trying to scare me, he was warning me. The family wouldn't give up their claim without a fight, and I had to be ready to face them head on. I spent the next few days in a haze of research and determination. Mr. Harrington worked with me tirelessly, poring over legal documents, searching for every loophole and clause in my grandfather's will. The truth about my mother and James Fletcher was powerful, but I needed more. I needed evidence that would stand up in court. I tracked down every old friend of my mother's. I could find women who had known her when she was young, men who had danced with her at parties, neighbors who had watched her slip away in the dead of night, heartbroken but determined. Piece by piece, their stories formed a mosaic of who she had been, a woman who had loved fiercely and refused to be broken even when the world tried to erase her. But for every scrap of evidence, I found Trevor and his allies worked twice as hard to bury it. I got phone calls late at night, voices I didn't recognize telling me to stop. Anonymous letters slipped under my door, warning me that I was digging up things better left buried. I didn't care. Each threat only strengthened my resolve. One evening, Margaret called me, her voice hushed and urgent. "Lila," she said, "you need to come see me. There's something else you should know." I drove out to her farmhouse in the dying light of the day, the sky streaked with purple and gold. She met me at the door, her face lined with worry. "Come in," she said, glancing over her shoulder, as if the shadows might be listening. In her warm kitchen, she poured us both cups of tea, the steam curling in the lamplight. She took my hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "I didn't tell you everything, Lila," she said quietly. "I thought I was protecting you, but maybe I was only protecting myself." My heart pounded. "What do you mean?" She sighed. "Your mother. She didn't just love James. They planned to run away together. They had everything arranged, tickets, a small cottage in the mountains. They were going to leave it all behind. But your grandfather found out." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "What did he do?" "He threatened them," she said. "Said he'd ruin James, destroy your mother's name. But more than that, he threatened you, Lila. Even before you were born." The weight of it settled over me like a stone. My grandfather had used me, my life, as a weapon. It was more than cruelty, it was control. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Your mother gave up everything to protect you. She stayed in that house, lived with the shame and the whispers, because she believed it was the only way to keep you safe." I closed my eyes, the truth cutting deeper than any lie ever had. My mother hadn't been weak. She had been strong in ways I was only beginning to understand. "Thank you for telling me," I said softly, squeezing Margaret's hands. I needed to know. When I left her house, the night was deep and dark, the stars bright above me. I felt my mother's strength in the cold air, the echo of her laughter in the wind, and I promised her right then that I would finish what she started. The next day, I returned to the estate, this time, not as a ghost slipping through the shadows, but as the rightful heir, determined to claim my place. I wore the locket proudly, the proof of my mother's love resting against my skin like armor. Trevor met me at the door, his expression smug. "Back again," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "You really don't know when to quit." I looked him square in the eyes. "I'm not here to quit, Trevor. I'm here to reclaim what's mine." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You think a few love letters and a locket will change anything? You're delusional, Lila." I didn't flinch. "It's not just a locket, it's proof of who I am. And you can't bury the truth forever." For a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes, fear maybe, or uncertainty. But then he shrugged it off, his smile turning cold. "Good luck with that," he said, stepping aside. The lawyers waiting in the study. Mr. Harrington was already there, stacks of papers spread across the polished table. He looked up as I entered, his expression grave. "Lila," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "We've gathered everything we need. The marriage license, the letters, the testimonies from your mother's friends. It's enough to challenge the will." I took a deep breath, my hands steady. "Then let's do it." He nodded. "It won't be easy. They'll try to tear you down, question everything about you and your mother. But you have the truth on your side." I met his gaze. "That's all I need. As we prepared the case, I felt the weight of generations of silence shifting. My mother's voice, once hidden in locked rooms and dusty letters, was finally rising to the surface, and I wouldn't let anyone silence her again. When the day of the hearing came, I stood in the old courthouse, my fingers wrapped around the locket, my heart steady in my chest. Trevor sat across from me, his eyes cold and watchful. Aunt Evelyn was there too, her mouth set in a hard line, as if she could will me out of existence with her glare. But I didn't look away. I lifted my chin, remembering my mother's words. The heart doesn't choose what's convenient, it just chooses. I chose to stand. I chose to fight. As the judge called the room to order, I felt the weight of every secret, every lie, every moment of shame that had been heaped on my mother's shoulders. And I knew that no matter what happened next, I was no longer the forgotten granddaughter. I was the true heir, and I was ready for whatever came next. The air in the courthouse felt like it had been bottled up for centuries, heavy with dust and old arguments. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of restless family members, and the smell of polished wood and musty carpet filled my nose. I sat in the front row, my back straight, my fingers wrapped tightly around the locket at my neck. Across the aisle, Trevor lounged in his seat, his eyes glinting with something that looked like amusement. Aunt Evelyn was next to him, her lips pressed so tight they had turned white. The lawyer they'd hired, a man with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, leaned close to whisper in Trevor's ear. I could feel the eyes of the room on me, some curious, some skeptical, some waiting for me to break. But I wouldn't give them that. I wasn't the same girl who used to slip through the halls of the mansion, afraid to be noticed. I was my mother's daughter. And I was done hiding. Mr. Harrington sat beside me, his papers stacked neatly on the table, his expression calm but watchful. "Remember, Lila," he said softly, "they'll try to twist your words. Just keep to the facts. Let the truth speak for itself." I nodded, my heart hammering in my chest. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense tone, called the room to order. "We're here today to consider the challenge to the will of Henry Whitmore," she said. "Miss Lila Whitmore claims to be the rightful heir to the estate. Let's proceed." Trevor's lawyer stood first, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter," he began. "Miss Whitmore was disinherited by her grandfather's will. She has no legal claim to the estate. Her assertions are nothing more than desperate attempts to grasp at what was never hers." I felt my hands tighten on the locket, but I kept my face calm. Mr. Harrington stood next, his voice steady and sure. "Your Honor, what Miss Whitmore brings today is not desperation, it's the truth. We have documentation, testimony, and evidence that the original will does not reflect the reality of this family's legacy." The judge nodded. "Proceed with your evidence." One by one, Mr. Harrington laid out the pieces of my mother's story, the marriage license that tied her to James Fletcher, the letters that spoke of a love that defied everything my grandfather tried to impose, and the testimonies from people who had known her when she was young and full of dreams. Each document felt like a heartbeat, a steady rhythm that cut through the doubt and the lies. I watched Aunt Evelyn's face as the truth unfolded, watched the way her eyes narrowed, her mouth tightening with each revelation. Trevor shifted in his seat, his smirk faltering. When it was my turn to speak, I stood, my legs steady despite the tremor in my chest. "My mother wasn't a footnote in this family's history," I said, my voice clear. "She was its beating heart. My grandfather tried to erase her, but he couldn't. And he couldn't erase me either." The courtroom was silent. I could feel the weight of every eye, every breath. But I didn't flinch. Trevor's lawyer rose again, his smile tight. "Your Honor, these so-called love letters and personal testimonies are touching, but they don't prove legal ownership. They're nothing more than stories." Mr. Harrington stood, his voice sharp. "They are not just stories, they are the truth. And the truth is that this estate belongs to Miss Whitmore as the rightful heir." The judge listened, her expression unreadable. She called for a recess, and the courtroom emptied into the cold marble halls outside. I stood in the hallway, my shoulders tense, the weight of the past pressing against my spine. Trevor approached me, his steps slow and deliberate. "You're playing a dangerous game, Lila," he said, his voice low. "You think you're winning, but you're not. You're just making a fool of yourself." I looked him in the eyes, seeing the flicker of doubt behind the bravado. "I'm not playing any game, Trevor," I said. "I'm telling the truth. And you can't twist that away." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You really think the judge is going to believe a bunch of old letters and stories? You're nothing, Lila. You always have been." I didn't let his words sink in. I turned away back to Mr. Harrington, back to the file that held everything I needed. The weight of my mother's locket was a comfort against my skin, a promise that I wasn't alone. When the hearing resumed, the judge looked out over the courtroom, her gaze sharp and focused. "I have considered the evidence," she said slowly. "The documentation, the testimonies, the historical record, and I find that there is sufficient cause to proceed with a formal challenge to the will." A murmur rippled through the room. Trevor's face went pale, and Aunt Evelyn's mouth fell open. I felt a surge of relief wash through me, but I didn't let it show on my face. "This matter is far from settled," the judge continued, "but it will be heard. Miss Whitmore, you may proceed with your claim to the estate. The court will reconvene in 2 weeks to review the final arguments." I knotted my throat tight. 2 weeks? 2 weeks to prove beyond any doubt that I was the rightful heir. 2 weeks to gather every last piece of evidence, every last memory my mother had left behind. As the courtroom emptied, Mr. Harrington turned to me, a small smile breaking the lines of his face. "You did well, Lila," he said. "This is just the beginning, but you're stronger than you know." I took a deep breath, my shoulders straight. "We're going to finish this," I said. "For my mother, for everything she was forced to leave behind." He nodded. "For her, and for you." As we walked out into the winter light, the cold wind cutting across my face, I felt the strength of my mother's love like a shield around me. They could try to bury the truth, to deny me my place in this family, but they couldn't bury the bond between a mother and her daughter. They said I'd never get a penny. But they were wrong, and I was ready to prove it. The courthouse was bathed in winter sunlight. When I returned 2 weeks later, the light catching in the polished marble floors and the worn wooden benches. My heart thudded in my chest as I stepped through the doors, the familiar scent of old paper and polished wood grounding me. Today was the day. Today, everything my mother had hidden, everything she'd fought so hard to protect, would finally be seen. And I would stand in her place, demanding the justice she never had. Mr. Harrington walked beside me, his suit crisp, and his expression calm but watchful. "This is it, Lila," he said as we approached the courtroom doors. "They'll come at you with everything they have. But remember, this isn't just about them. It's about you and the truth." I knotted my fingers, brushing against the locket at my neck. My mother's locket. Her memory, her love, her strength, it was all with me. Inside the courtroom was already filling. Trevor sat at the other table, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. Aunt Evelyn's eyes burned into me like cold steel, but I didn't look away. I wouldn't be the one to flinch. The judge took her seat, her sharp eyes sweeping the room. "Let's begin," she said, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "Mr. Harrington, your opening statement." Mr. Harrington rose, his voice steady and sure. "Your Honor, we are here today to prove not just a legal claim, but a moral one. Miss Whitmore is the rightful heir to the estate of Henry Whitmore, not because of money or property, but because she is the daughter of a woman who was denied her place in this family's history. We have evidence, documents, testimonies, and above all, the truth." The judge nodded, her pen poised over her notes. "Proceed." Trevor's lawyer stood, his smile thin. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a desperate bid for wealth. Miss Whitmore's so-called evidence is hearsay, romantic letters, old photographs, nothing that can stand in the light of day." I felt a flicker of anger, but I didn't let it show. Mr. Harrington didn't either. He began to lay out our case, piece by piece: the marriage certificate that tied my mother to James Fletcher, the letters that spoke of their love, the sworn testimonies of those who had known them. Each word was like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through the courtroom. I watched Trevor's face as the truth settled in around him, watched his jaw tighten, the way his fingers drummed on the table. Aunt Evelyn shifted in her seat, her face pale. I could see the cracks in their confidence now, the way the weight of their lies was finally pressing down. When it was my turn to testify, I stood my knees shaking, but my voice steady. My mother loved James Fletcher. I said my words ringing clear. He was my father in every way that mattered. My grandfather tried to erase him and her from this family's story, but he couldn't erase me. I held up the locket, its silver catching the light. This was hers. And now it's mine. Just like this estate. The silence in the room was electric. For a moment, no one moved. Then Trevor's lawyer stood, his smile brittle. "Miss Whitmore, do you have any concrete proof that your mother was married to Mr. Fletcher? That you are in fact his child?" My hands didn't shake as I passed the file to the judge. The marriage license, the letters. And if that's not enough, we have affidavits from those who knew them. He tried to rattle me, his questions sharp and fast. "But what about your grandfather's will? It explicitly cut you out." I met his gaze head on. "Because he was afraid of the truth. But that doesn't make it any less real." The judge took it all in her pen, scratching across the paper as she listened. When I finished, she nodded. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore. Please step down." As I returned to my seat, Trevor's lawyer rose again, calling Trevor to the stand. He walked up with that easy practice smirk, like he was just humoring the room. But, as the questions came, the cracks in his calm started to show. He claimed I was lying, that I was making it all up to get my hands on the money. But every time he spoke, I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, like he knew he was clinging to a crumbling wall. When Mr. Harrington cross-examined him, the questions came quick and sharp. "Did you ever see the letters Miss Whitmore found?" "No," Trevor admitted, his voice tight. "Did you know about her mother's marriage?" He hesitated. I didn't think it was real." "But it was real, wasn't it?" Mr. Harrington pressed. "And you tried to bury it just like your grandfather did." Trevor's face flushed, his jaw tightening. "I did what I had to do to protect the family's name." I watched him, the truth finally laid bare. He wasn't protecting the family. He was protecting himself. As the final arguments were made, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I had done everything I could. I had spoken the truth, and I had given my mother's story the voice it deserved. The judge called for a recess, the gavel ringing out like a promise. "I will issue my ruling tomorrow," she said. "Court is adjourned for today." As the room emptied, Trevor paused by my chair, his expression tight. "You think you've won," he said, his voice low. "But you don't understand what this family is capable of." I met his gaze, my shoulders straight. "Maybe. But I know what I'm capable of, Trevor. And I'm not afraid of you anymore." He didn't say anything else. He just turned and walked away. Mr. Harrington touched my shoulder. "You did it, Lila," he said quietly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you stood up for your mother. And for yourself." I took a deep breath, the weight of it all settling in my chest. "Thank you," I said, "for believing in me." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, the locket warm in my palm, the stars bright and sharp outside my window. My mother's face filled my mind, her laughter, her love, the quiet strength she had carried, even when everything was against her. I whispered into the dark, "I'm almost there, Mom. I'm almost home." Tomorrow everything would change. One way or another, the truth would finally be seen. And I was ready. The sun rose pale and cold the next morning, painting the courthouse in thin bands of light and shadow. My breath clouded in the chilly air as I climbed the steps, each footfall echoing with the weight of everything that had come before. Inside the courtroom felt different today. The tension was a living thing, coiled and waiting. Aunt Evelyn sat stiff and silent in her usual seat, her lips pressed tight and her eyes hard. Trevor was there too, his jaw set, his fingers drumming a restless beat on the table in front of him. Mr. Harrington gave me a reassuring nod as I took my seat. "Whatever happens, Lila," he murmured, "remember that you fought for the truth. That's what matters." I swallowed the lump in my throat, my hand brushing the locket at my neck. My mother's presence felt close, like a warm whisper against my skin, urging me to be brave. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in the memory of her smile, her laughter, her love. The judge entered her black robe, whispering softly as she took her seat. The gavel's sharp crack brought the room to a hush. "We are here to deliver the verdict in the matter of the Whitmore estate," she said, her voice calm, but edged with finality. "I have reviewed all evidence, presented the documents, the testimonies, the historical record. I have considered the arguments from both parties." My heart thundered in my chest, each beat loud in my ears. My hands curled around the edge of the bench, knuckles white. The judge looked up, her eyes sweeping the room. "This is not merely a question of money or property," she said. "This is a question of truth and of justice, long denied." Aunt Evelyn shifted in her seat, a flicker of unease passing over her face. Trevor leaned forward, his mouth tightening. The judge took a breath. "I find that Miss Lila Whitmore has provided sufficient evidence to prove her claim. The marriage between her mother and James Fletcher is legally recognized, making Miss Whitmore the rightful heir to the estate." The words hung in the air like a bell's clear ring, bright and undeniable. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a gasp, a small sound, but it felt like it cracked the room open. Aunt Evelyn's face went white, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't find the words. Trevor slumped back in his seat, his eyes wide and hollow. I felt a rush of heat in my chest, a surge of something bright and fierce. Relief, maybe. Vindication. The quiet, certain knowledge that I had done what my mother never could. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, "I order that the estate be transferred to Miss Whitmore, effective immediately. All previous claims are void." Trevor's lawyer leapt to his feet. "Your Honor, this is unprecedented. We will appeal." The judge's gavel struck the wood with finality. "You have the right to appeal," she said evenly. "But for now, this is my ruling. Court is adjourned." The room erupted in a low hum of voices, some shocked, some triumphant. I sat frozen, my hands still gripping the bench, my mind struggling to catch up with the reality of what I'd just heard. Mr. Harrington touched my shoulder, his smile warm and proud. "You did it, Lila," he said softly. "It's yours. All of it." I stood slowly, my legs trembling, but strong beneath me. I turned to look at Aunt Evelyn, her face pale, and pinched her eyes, burning with something that looked almost like hatred. But I didn't flinch. Trevor pushed himself to his feet, his jaw working. "You think this means you've won?" he spat. "You have no idea what you're getting into. That house, that land, it'll eat you alive." I met his gaze, calm and steady. "It's my family's house," I said quietly, "and I'm going to make sure it's a place worth living in again." He snorted, turning away, with a dismissive flick of his hand. "Good luck," he muttered. "You'll need it." Mr. Harrington and I walked out of the courthouse together, the winter sun bright and sharp on the steps. The cold air felt different now, cleaner, like it had been swept clear of the lies and shadows that had clung to my family for so long. As we reached the bottom of the steps, I paused, looking back at the building that had been the battleground for my mother's honor and my own future. I whispered a soft thank you to her, and to the quiet strength that had carried me this far. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, the enormity of it all pressing down on me in gentle waves. I went back to my tiny apartment, sat on the couch, and let the weight of the verdict settle over me. The estate was mine now. The house that had always been a symbol of exclusion and pain would finally be a home again. That night, I drove out to the mansion. The sky was clear, the moon a silver coin high above. The house loomed dark and silent as I pulled into the drive, the gravel crunching softly under the tires. I got out and stood for a moment, staring up at the grand, silent facade. My breath misted in the cold air, my heart steady and sure. I walked up the steps, the key in my hand, heavy and solid. The lock clicked open, and I stepped inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and memories of old secrets and new beginnings. I moved from room to room, my fingers brushing over the worn banisters, the cold marble of the fireplace, the faded velvet of the drawing room chairs. Each room held echoes of my mother's laughter, the quiet strength she had carried, even in the face of everything. In the library, I paused. The hidden door was still there, the latch cool under my fingertips. I opened it and stepped into the small secret room, the place where my mother had kept her memories safe. I lit a candle and placed it on the small table, the flame flickering in the shadows. The locket at my neck felt warm against my skin, and I could almost hear her voice in the quiet. I believe in you, Lila. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I did it, Mom, I whispered. It's mine. It's ours. The house was quiet around me, but I felt her there, her love woven into every beam and stone, every breath of the cold winter air. I knew there would be more to come, more challenges, more fights. But for the first time, I felt ready. I wasn't just claiming an inheritance. I was reclaiming a home, a history, a future. I was done being the forgotten granddaughter. I was the heir. And I was just getting started. The next morning dawned cold and bright, the winter sun painting the estate in shimmering light. I woke early, my breath fogging in the chill of the old mansion's rooms. The quiet was no longer oppressive. It felt expectant, like the house itself was waiting to see what I would do. I walked through the halls, the familiar creak of the floorboards under my feet, grounding me in this new reality. The portraits of my ancestors watched me with somber eyes, but I didn't feel like an intruder anymore. This was my home now, no matter how many people had tried to deny it. I opened windows to let in the crisp morning air, the cold biting at my skin, but invigorating all the same. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, the house breathing in the fresh air, as if shaking off decades of silence. In the kitchen, I found the staff gathered, some I remembered from childhood, others new. They looked at me warily, at first unsure what to expect from the girl they'd watched grow up in the corners of their memories. I offered them a small smile. "Good morning," I said simply. "Thank you for everything you've done. I know it hasn't been easy." They exchanged glances, and then one older woman, a cook with kind eyes, stepped forward. "We're here to help, Miss Whitmore," she said. "Whatever you need." The words settled in my chest like a warm weight. I knotted my throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," I said again, meaning it more than I ever had. I spent the rest of the morning in my mother's old room, the locket warm against my skin as I sorted through the pieces of her life. Dresses still hung in the wardrobe, their fabrics soft with age and memory. A perfume bottle sat on the vanity, the scent of lavender still faintly clinging to it. I sat on the edge of the bed and let my fingers trail over the quilt, each stitch a small testament to the woman she had been. My mother had lived a life of quiet defiance, loving a man her family deemed unworthy, raising me in the shadow of that choice. Now it was my turn to carry that legacy forward. The afternoon passed in a blur of decisions, meeting with Mr. Harrington to begin the legal transfer of the estate, answering calls from banks and property managers who wanted to know what would happen next. Each conversation was a small victory, a step further away from the girl who had once felt invisible in these halls. But it was the evening when the real work began. I gathered the staff in the grand dining room, the long table polished and gleaming under the warm glow of the chandelier. They looked at me with a mix of curiosity and caution, their expressions wary. I took a deep breath. "This house has been a symbol of division for too long," I said, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. "But I want to change that." My mother believed in second chances in making things right, even when it seemed impossible. "That's what I want this house to stand for now." The cook nodded slowly, a small smile breaking over her face. "What do you have in mind, miss?" I hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "We're going to restore it. Not just the paint and the furniture, but the spirit of the place. I want this house to feel like a home for all of us." There was a moment of silence, and then another voice spoke up, a young groundskeeper, his cap in his hands. "We're with you, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes." I felt a surge of gratitude so strong it made my eyes sting. "Thank you," I said again, the words feeling like a promise. We spent the next few hours making plans, talking about repairs, about renovations, about how to breathe life back into a place that had grown cold with time. The staff's voices grew animated, their eyes bright with possibility. For the first time, the house felt alive around us, each idea sparking in the dark corners, like fireflies. As the night wore on, I slipped away to the hidden room, the place where my mother had kept her memories safe. I lit a candle and sat cross-legged on the worn rug, the flickering light painting shadows on the stone walls. I pulled the locket from around my neck and opened it, staring at the tiny photograph of my mother and James. Their smiles were frozen in time, their love captured in that fragile moment. My throat tightened. "I hope you're proud," I whispered into the quiet. "I'm going to make this right." The room seemed to sigh around me, the air shifting as if the house itself was listening. When I finally emerged, the mansion was quiet again, the staff gone to their beds, the halls dark and still. I walked up the grand staircase, my footsteps soft on the runner, my heart steady in my chest. I paused at the top, looking back at the foyer below. The shadows pooled there, but they didn't feel threatening anymore. They felt like memories, echoes of laughter and love and everything that had come before. In my new bedroom, once my grandfather's, I stood by the window staring out at the moonlit gardens below. The frost on the grass sparkled in the light, a quiet testament to the beauty of beginnings. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, my breath fogging the pain. "This is just the start," I said softly, the words a vow. For my mother, for James, for every child who'd ever felt like they didn't belong. The estate was mine now, but more than that, it was my responsibility. A chance to heal old wounds, to build something new and true. A place where the past wasn't something to fear, but something to honor and learn from. As I turned from the window and pulled the covers over me, I felt a peace settle in my chest. The battles weren't over, but I was no longer fighting alone. Tomorrow, I would begin again, brick by brick, breath by breath, rebuilding the estate, rebuilding our family's story, rebuilding my life. And for the first time in years, I let sleep find me wrapped in the quiet certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The next morning, I woke to the gentle glow of sunlight streaming through the lace curtains. The air in the mansion felt different now, warmer, lighter, as if the weight of years had finally been lifted. I dressed and walked through the halls, pausing to run my fingers along the smooth wood of the banisters. Each room I passed held memories, some painful, some sweet, but they no longer felt like ghosts haunting me. They felt like echoes of a story that had finally found its ending. In the garden, the roses my mother had once tended were covered in frost, their petals glinting like tiny jewels. I knelt in the cold earth and touched them gently, promising her I would nurture them back to life. The staff joined me later in the morning, their voices warm with laughter as we shared coffee in the bright kitchen. Plans for the future buzzed around us, ideas for community events, for restoration projects, for ways to make the estate a living testament to the love and legacy my mother had left behind. I knew there would still be challenges. Old resentments don't vanish overnight. But I also knew I had the strength to face them. My mother's strength. My own. As the sun reached its highest point, I returned to the hidden room one last time. I lit a single candle and stood in the soft glow, my mother's locket resting against my heart. I did it. I whispered the words, a quiet prayer of gratitude. I kept your promise alive. And now I'm going to build something beautiful, something you would be proud of. I felt her there, in the hush of the room, in the warmth of the flickering light. A soft smile touched my lips as I turned and walked out, ready to face whatever the future held. The estate was no longer a symbol of everything I'd lost. It was a place of hope and belonging, a testament to love that refused to be silenced. This is my story, my family's story, and it's only just begun. If you found this story inspiring and powerful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Share your thoughts below. Have you ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours? I'd love to hear your story. Let's keep these conversations alive.